The dust of the high plains had settled a fine, gritty powder over the hem of her white prairie dress. It was the only dress she owned, purchased for her in San Francisco by a man whose name she could not remember, for a journey that had erased weeks from the calendar. Now, standing before the man who was to be her husband, Lynn felt the vast, empty silence of the Wyoming Territory press in on all sides. He was taller than she had expected, with shoulders made broad by work, not by the cut of his coat. His face was weathered by sun and wind, and his eyes, a startling pale blue, held a look of weary pragmatism. Jedediah Stone had sent a letter and $50 to a broker. The letter was short. It said he needed a wife. It said he owned 2,000 acres, mostly rock and scrub, and a herd of longhorn cattle that were more wild than owned. It said the woman should be of good health and practical disposition. It did not mention loneliness. It did not mention the way the wind howled through the ill-fitting window frames of his cabin, a constant, mournful sound that echoed the hollowness in his own chest. He gestured with a calloused hand toward the low-slung cabin, a structure of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and straw. "This is it," he said. The words were gravelly, as if he rarely used them. Lynn understood perhaps one word in three, but the meaning was clear. This was her new world. She gave a short, formal nod, her gaze fixed on a point just past his shoulder. She followed him inside, her small trunk bumping against the door frame. The interior was a single room, shadowed and smelling of wood smoke, bacon grease, and old leather. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a narrow bed another. A rough plank table and 2 stools stood in the center. But it was the windows that drew her eye. They were covered not with glass, but with greased paper, and the curtains hanging beside them were little more than tattered rags, once a cheerful yellow gingham, now faded and torn, fluttering like wounded birds in the draught. Jed saw where she was looking. He walked over to the window, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He pointed a thick finger at the shredded fabric. He made a pinching motion with his other hand, then a motion like pushing a needle. He looked at her, a question in his pale eyes. "So," he asked, the single word stark in the quiet room. "Can you fix?" It was the question his entire proposal had hinged upon. The broker had assured him the girl was skilled in domestic arts. He needed someone to turn this rough shelter into a home, to push back against the encroaching wilderness with the simple tools of civilization, a hot meal, a mended shirt, a curtain to block the unending stare of the night. Lynn looked from his questioning face to the tattered cloth. In her trunk, wrapped in silk, was a small, lacquered box containing needles as fine as fish bones and spools of thread that her mother had taught her to dye with flowers and roots. She was the daughter of a master embroiderer, a woman whose stitches could make a phoenix seem to take flight from a piece of silk. She had been raised to create beauty so intricate it could make a merchant prince weep. But all this man, her husband, was asking for was a patch. A slow nod was her only answer. She did not smile. She did not offer any sign of the vast, untapped reservoir of skill that lay dormant within her. She simply nodded. For now, it was enough. He seemed to release a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He had asked for a woman who could sew curtains. It appeared he had gotten one. What he did not yet know was that the quiet girl in the dusty white dress held the thread that could stitch his entire broken world back together. For the first week, they moved around each other in a silent, careful dance. Jed would rise before dawn, stoke the fire, and be gone to the corrals before she had fully woken. He left a portion of smoked bacon and a sack of cornmeal on the table. Her job was to turn it into sustenance. She learned the rhythms of his life by the objects he left behind, the worn-out work gloves with split seams, the shirt with a torn elbow, the saddle blanket frayed at the edges. Each evening, he would return, covered in the dust and sweat of his labor, and find a hot meal waiting. He would eat without much comment, then take his pipe to the porch, leaving her to the quiet of the cabin. On the third day, she approached the curtains. She took them down carefully, the fabric disintegrating in her hands. It was a hopeless task to repair them. Instead, she opened her trunk. She had one other dress, a simple one of dark blue calico, meant for work. But she also had the white cotton chemises and petticoats she had worn on the journey. They were sturdy, well-made garments. With a small, sharp pair of scissors from her sewing box, she began to cut. She worked all day, the snip of her scissors a quiet counterpoint to the buzz of flies against the greased paper windows. She did not make simple squares. She cut the cotton into strips, folded them, and began to stitch them into a delicate, interlocking pattern she remembered from a screen in her grandfather's house. It was a simple pattern, one of clouds and water, but her stitches were so small and even they seemed to disappear into the fabric. She used the sturdiest parts of the old yellow gingham for a border, a small nod to what had been there before. When Jed returned that evening, the last of the summer sun was slanting through the windows, illuminating the new curtains. They were pristine white, with a cheerful yellow edge, and the intricate pattern of the stitching caught the light, giving them a depth and texture that was wholly unexpected. He stopped dead in the doorway, his hat in his hands. He stared. He had expected patches. He had expected a functional, clumsy repair. He had not expected this. He had not expected beauty. He looked from the curtains to Lynn, who was standing by the hearth, her hands folded before her, her expression unreadable. "You did this?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She nodded once. He walked closer, touching the fabric. It was soft, yet strong. The seams were flawless. He had never seen work like it. "It's good," he said, the word inadequate. He looked back at her, a flicker of something new in his eyes, not just pragmatism, but a dawning curiosity. Very good that night, when he sat on the porch, he found his gaze drifting back to the warm, gentle light glowing through the new curtains, a beacon of order in the vast, wild dark. The curtains were only the beginning. Soon, a rhythm was established. Jed would leave a torn shirt on a stool, and by evening it would be returned to his bed, the tear not just patched but woven back together so skillfully the original damage was nearly invisible. A pair of his work trousers, worn through at the knees, reappeared with new patches of sturdy canvas, stitched with a double seam that would outlast the original garment. The two ranch hands Jed employed, a young man named Billy and an older, gruff cowboy named Silas, noticed the change. Jed's clothes were no longer ragged. He seemed to stand a little straighter. One afternoon, a sudden, violent hailstorm swept down from the mountains. It lasted only 10 minutes, but the ice stones, some as large as a hen's egg, were brutal. Jed and the hands were out with the herd, trying to push them into the relative safety of a box canyon. They returned soaked and bruised, to find that the storm had shredded the canvas cover on their main supply wagon. It was a disaster. The canvas was their protection against the elements for the weekly trip to the railhead for supplies. A new one would cost a month's profit, money Jed simply did not have. "Damn it all," Silas spat, kicking at a wagon wheel. "That's the last thing we needed. Everything will be ruined if another squall comes through." Jed surveyed the damage, his face a grim mask. The canvas was peppered with holes and long, jagged rips. It looked like it had been attacked with a knife. He ran a hand over his face. "We'll figure something out," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The next morning, Jed and the men rode out early to check for scattered cattle. Lynn was left alone at the ranch. She went to the wagon. She ran her small hands over the ruined canvas, feeling the thickness of the material, the way the fibers had been torn. It was a much larger problem than a curtain or a shirt, but the principle was the same. She dragged the heavy, wet canvas into the barn to dry. Then she went back to her trunk. Tucked in the bottom was a bolt of heavy, oiled duck cloth she had bought in San Francisco, thinking it might be useful. She had also collected scraps of leather from the farrier's waste pile and the tanner's bin. From Jed's tool shed, she borrowed a heavy-duty awl and a sailmaker's palm. She did not just patch the holes. She cut away the weakest sections and replaced them with new cloth, overlapping the seams and stitching them with heavy, waxed thread in a crosshatch pattern that distributed the tension. Where the grommets had been torn out, she fashioned new ones from circles of thick leather, stitching them into place so they were stronger than the original metal rings. She worked through the day and into the evening, her small lamp casting a circle of light in the cavernous barn. When Jed, Billy, and Silas rode in the next afternoon, bone-weary and grim, the first thing they saw was the canvas, stretched out between two posts. It was no longer a tattered ruin. It was a mosaic of old and new fabric, a testament to hours of meticulous labor. Billy whistled low. "I'll be." "Who did that?" Jed dismounted and walked toward it, his boot stirring up dust. He ran his hand over a new seam. It was tight, waterproof, and stronger than the original. He saw the leather reinforcements, the clever way she had used different weights of thread for different kinds of stress. This wasn't mending. This was engineering. He turned and saw Lynn standing in the doorway of the cabin, wiping her hands on an apron she had made from a flour sack. She watched him, her dark eyes searching his face. "She did this?" Silas said, his voice full of disbelief. "The little China girl." Jed's head snapped around. He took 2 steps toward the older man, his expression hard as granite. "Her name is Lynn," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And her work just saved this ranch a month's wages. You will show her the respect she's earned." Silas, stunned by his boss's ferocity, could only stammer, "Yes, sir." "Of course, Jed." Jed turned back to Lynn. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. He didn't have the words to express the mixture of gratitude and awe he felt. He simply looked at the canvas, then back at her, and gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was a nod that said more than a dozen flowery speeches. It said, "I see you. I see what you can do." That night, the cabin felt different. The silence was no longer a chasm between them, but a shared, comfortable space. As Lynn banked the fire for the night, Jed noticed a piece of scrap paper on the table. On it, drawn with a piece of charcoal, was a complex geometric pattern of interlocking stars. It was a design for a quilt. He picked it up, studying the intricate lines. He had asked for a woman who could sew curtains, a simple transaction. But he was beginning to suspect he had found an artist who spoke a language of thread and cloth, a language he was only just beginning to learn. What he saw in the drawing was not just a pattern for a blanket, it was a map of a world he had never known existed, a world of patience, precision, and a quiet, unyielding strength that humbled him. The respect Jed had demanded from Silas slowly began to permeate the ranch. Billy started bringing Lynn small things, a handful of late-season wildflowers, a curiously shaped stone from a creek bed, leaving them on the porch railing for her to find. Even Silas began to tip his hat when he saw her, his gruffness softening into a reluctant admiration. But the true change was between Lynn and Jed. He started talking to her more, not just about chores, but about the ranch itself. He would point to a section of fence that needed mending or a part of the roof that leaked, and she would listen, her head tilted, absorbing the information. One evening, as she was clearing the supper dishes, he noticed a small, silken pouch sitting on her sewing box. It was a deep blue, embroidered with a single, perfect white blossom. The stitching was so fine it looked like it had been painted on. "That's beautiful," he said, his voice quiet in the lamp-lit room. He reached out, then stopped himself, not wanting to presume. Lynn saw his hesitation. She picked up the pouch and held it out to him. He took it carefully. The silk was cool and smooth against his calloused skin. "My mother," she said, her English still halting, but clearer now. "She teach." She used gestures and the few words they now shared to tell him a story. It was a story of a workshop filled with light, the smell of silk and charcoal, and the quiet hum of women at work. Her family had been renowned for their embroidery in a province far across the ocean. This pouch, a gift for her own mother, was one of the last things she had made before drought and famine took everything. Coming to America wasn't a choice, it was the only option left. Jed listened, his chest tightening. He had seen her as a solution to a practical problem. He had never considered the life she had been forced to leave behind, the losses she carried in her quiet heart. In that moment, she was no longer the mail-order bride, but Lynn, a woman with a history as rich and complex as the patterns she stitched. He felt a sudden urge to share something of his own, to bridge the remaining distance between them. "This place," he began, gesturing to the cabin, the world outside its walls. "It was my father's." He worked himself into an early grave trying to tame it. Left me the land, and the debt that came with it. He confessed his own secret fear, that he was failing. That the land was too hard, the weather too cruel, the bank too unforgiving. It was the most he had spoken at one time since she had arrived. He was revealing his own vulnerability, his own hidden history of struggle. Lynn looked at him, her dark eyes filled with a new understanding. They were two different people from two different worlds, but they were both survivors, bound by loss and the quiet determination to build something new from the wreckage of the past. The fragile piece of their new understanding was shattered a week later by the arrival of the mail rider. He brought a single letter for Jed, the envelope bearing the official stamp of the Territorial Bank and Trust in Cheyenne. Jed's face went pale as he read it. "What is it?" Lynn asked, seeing the grim set of his jaw. "It's the bank," he said, his voice flat. "Mr. Bishop is calling in a portion of the loan. He says the value of the collateral, the ranch, has declined. He's sending an agent to inspect the property in 2 weeks." "Inspect?" "It's a sham," Jed said, crushing the letter in his fist. "He wants the land. There's talk of the railroad building a spur line through this valley. If they do, this scrubland becomes a fortune. He wants to foreclose before that happens." The amount was staggering, $200. It might as well have been $2,000. His first, desperate thought was to sell his prize bull, a magnificent Hereford he had spent 2 years' savings on. It would be a catastrophic blow to his plans to improve the herd's bloodline, setting him back years. It was the only asset he had that could raise that kind of cash quickly. He explained this to Lynn, his voice heavy with defeat. The bull was his future. But the ranch was his past and his present. He saw no other choice. Lynn listened, her brow furrowed. When he was finished, she shook her head. "No," she said. The word was soft, but firm. She went to the large chest at the foot of their bed. Over the past months, she hadn't just been mending. She had been creating. Using scraps from the wagon canvas, old blankets, and denim from worn-out trousers, she had pieced together 6 thick, warm quilts. The patterns were not the delicate flowers of her homeland, but bold, strong, geometric designs that spoke of mountains and plains. They were beautiful, but more than that, they were practical. She had also sewn 2 sturdy work shirts from a bolt of canvas, and a winter coat for Billy, lined with the wool from a sheep that had been lost to a wolf. She laid it all out on the table. The quilts, the shirts, the mended and reinforced clothes. It was a collection of her time, her skill, her quiet industry. "The town," she said, looking up at him. "Founder's Day. Next week." Jed stared at her. The Founder's Day Fair was the biggest social event of the year. People came from 100 miles around. There would be a market. "You want to sell these?" he asked, touching a quilt. It was heavy and warm. The stitching was perfect. "Yes," she said. It was a crazy idea. Who would buy used or handmade goods when they could order from a catalog? It felt like begging. But then he looked at the work. He saw the quality, the strength, the care that went into every stitch. He looked at Lynn, her face determined, her eyes shining with a fierce belief in her own work. To sell the bull was his plan, a plan born of desperation. This was her plan, a plan born of creativity and hope. Trusting her meant letting go of his own pride, his own idea of how a man solves his problems. It was a terrifying leap of faith. He looked at the pile of goods, a testament to her quiet strength. Then he looked at her, the woman who had turned his drafty shack into a warm home, who had faced his world with a courage he was only now beginning to appreciate. "All right, Lynn," he said, his voice hoarse. "We'll do it your way." The 3 months that followed felt like a lifetime had passed. The harsh glare of summer had softened into the golden, slanted light of autumn. Inside the cabin, new curtains, made from a bolt of cheerful blue calico bought with their fair earnings, filtered the morning sun. The single room no longer felt like a temporary shelter, but a permanent home. The air was filled with the scent of cinnamon and drying herbs, and a large, brightly colored quilt of Lynn's own design was now spread across the bed. Their trip to the Founders' Day fair had been a revelation. Jed had built a small stall, and Lynn had arranged her wares with an artist's eye. At first, people walked by, glancing curiously at the quiet Chinese woman and the rough-looking cowboy. Then, a rancher's wife, a woman known for her discerning eye, stopped. She picked up one of Lynn's quilts. She felt the weight of it, saw the thousands of tiny, perfect stitches, the clever use of durable fabrics. She compared it to the flimsy, factory-made blankets for sale at the general store for twice the price. She bought it on the spot. That one sale broke the dam. Soon, their stall was swarmed. Wives and mothers, tired of shoddy goods and endless mending, saw the value in Lynn's work. Her reinforced work shirts were snatched up by men who recognized quality. Her patched and strengthened canvas bags were more popular than new ones. By the end of the day, they had sold everything. Jed stood by, stunned, as Lynn counted a pile of cash and coin that amounted to more than $250. They had enough to pay the bank, with a surplus for winter supplies. When the bank agent arrived a week later, he did not find the failing, dilapidated ranch he had been sent to condemn. He found a well-maintained homestead. He saw the repaired wagon cover, the newly patched roof on the barn, and the healthy-looking cattle in the corral. He met Jedediah Stone, a man who stood straighter, whose eyes held not desperation but a quiet confidence. The agent filed a report stating the collateral was sound and the owner was making significant improvements. Mr. Bishop's scheme was thwarted, at least for now. But the most significant change was not financial. Lynn's reputation had spread through the territory like a warm wind. Letters began to arrive, not from a bank, but from other ranches. A woman needed a wedding dress altered. A rancher wanted a durable winter coat. A mother wanted a quilt for her newborn child. Lynn was no longer just Jed's wife, she was Mistress Stone, the finest seamstress in the county. She even started teaching her quilting patterns to two of the other ranch wives, her small, nimble hands guiding their less experienced ones, her quiet instruction forging new bonds of community and friendship. One evening, Jed came in from the barn, the scent of hay and cold air clinging to him. The lamp was lit, and the fire cast a warm glow on the room. Lynn was sitting in her usual chair, but she wasn't working on a commission. She was mending one of his old, faded work shirts, the one he favored for its softness. It was a simple, domestic act, one that asked for nothing and offered everything. He went to the stove and poured 2 cups of tea, adding a spoonful of precious sugar to hers, just the way he had learned she liked it. He walked over and set 1 cup on the small table beside her. She looked up from her work, and the smile she gave him was not the shy, uncertain smile of the woman who had arrived in a dusty white dress. It was the warm, open smile of a partner, a confidant, a friend. He didn't say anything. He didn't have the words for the profound sense of peace and rightness that filled him. He simply reached out and laid his large, rough hand over hers on the worn fabric of the shirt. Her fingers stilled beneath his. In the quiet of the cabin, with the wind whispering outside, they sat together, 2 solitary people who had discovered that a home is not a place you find, but a thing you build together, stitch by careful stitch. A partnership, he was learning, was never about getting what you asked for. It was about the grace of receiving a gift you never thought to imagine. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.